It was almost midnight when Daniel Mercer turned into the driveway, nearly an hour earlier than Elena expected. Daniel switched off the engine and sat behind the wheel for several seconds, staring at the dark windows of the house. He had told himself he was coming home early because work had ended sooner than expected. That was the reasonable explanation. Lately, coming home had begun to feel like walking into a room where something had already happened. He stepped inside without turning on the lights. Her purse was on the kitchen counter. Her shoes were near the stairs. Everything looked normal. But normal had become difficult for Daniel to recognize. For months, Elena had been somewhere else even when she was standing directly in front of him. She answered questions with shorter sentences. She kept her phone face down. She started taking calls in another room. When Daniel entered, conversation seemed to disappear. He had noticed the pattern long before he had a name for it. Tonight, there was no argument waiting downstairs. No television playing. No music. Only a faint voice drifting from the second floor. Daniel stopped. He looked toward the staircase. Then he heard Elena laugh. It was soft, warm, almost playful. Daniel hadn't heard that laugh in months. He climbed the stairs slowly, one hand resting against the wall. With every step, the voice became clearer. Elena was speaking to someone. Her tone was different from the one she used with him. There was ease in it. Familiarity. At the bedroom door, Daniel stopped again. The door was slightly open. Through the narrow gap, he could see Elena sitting against the pillows, holding her phone in front of her. The screen illuminated her face. And then another man's face appeared on the screen. Daniel froze. For several seconds, he couldn't move. The stranger was smiling. Elena was smiling too. Daniel's first reaction wasn't anger. It was disbelief. His mind began searching for innocent explanations before his heart could accept the obvious ones. A coworker. An old friend. Someone from her family. Anyone except the person his imagination had already decided this man was. He stayed in the hallway, hidden by the darkness, listening. "I miss talking to you," Elena said quietly. The word struck harder than a confession. Daniel's fingers tightened against the doorframe. He could have walked in. He could have demanded an explanation. He could have ended the call immediately. Instead, he watched. Not because he was calm, but because some part of him was afraid that moving would make the truth real. Elena laughed again. Daniel looked down at the floor. He remembered every unanswered question from the past few months. Every late arrival. Every sudden silence. Every time Elena had taken her phone and walked away. Maybe none of those moments had been accidents. Maybe they had all been pieces of the same secret. Then Elena shifted in bed. Her eyes moved toward the doorway. Her smile disappeared. For one suspended second, husband and wife stared at each other. Elena looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at the phone. Then Elena quickly ended the call. The room became silent. He wished he had stayed at work a little longer. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "How long have you been standing there?" This ending leaves Chapter 2 with a natural opening for the story to move backward and reveal how Daniel and Elena's marriage reached this point, without revealing too much too soon. Before the bedroom door became a boundary between them, Daniel and Elena had once crossed that same distance without fear. They met 8 years earlier at a small neighborhood restaurant where Elena worked part-time while finishing a course in design. Daniel had come in after work, usually alone, usually ordering the same meal. He was quiet, polite, and almost painfully dependable. Elena noticed him because he listened when she talked. Daniel noticed Elena because she made every ordinary moment feel brighter. Their relationship moved quickly, but not recklessly. Daniel was steady where Elena was spontaneous. She filled silence. He made her feel safe inside it. Friends described them as opposites, who somehow fit perfectly. When Daniel proposed, Elena cried before she could answer. For a while, marriage seemed to make their differences even stronger in the best possible way. Daniel handled bills, repaired broken things, and remembered appointments. Elena brought warmth into the house, invited friends over, and filled their rooms with photographs, plants, and music. Then small changes began. Daniel started asking where Elena had been, not because he needed to know, but because he wanted reassurance. "Who were you with? What time did you leave? Why didn't you answer?" At first, Elena answered easily. She believed transparency would make him feel secure. Instead, every answer created another question. When Elena mentioned a male co-worker, Daniel remembered his name. When she laughed at a message, Daniel wanted to know who had sent it. When she stayed late after work, he asked why someone else couldn't have finished the task. None of those moments seemed dangerous alone. Together, they became a pattern. Daniel called it caring. Elena slowly began calling it exhausting. The first time she had a harmless conversation from him, she did it to prevent an argument. She deleted a message from an old friend because she knew Daniel would ask questions she didn't want to answer. Daniel eventually noticed. He didn't know what the message had said, only that it was gone. That was enough. His suspicion grew. Elena's silence grew with it. Their arguments became quieter, but somehow more damaging. They stopped shouting because both had learned exactly which words could wound the other. Daniel began believing Elena was withholding something. Elena began believing that anything she revealed would be used against her. The strange part was that neither entirely understood the role they were playing. Daniel's fear made him watch Elena more closely. Elena's discomfort made her hide more. Her secrecy then confirmed his fears. And his suspicion gave her another reason to keep secrets. It was a cycle neither knew how to stop. By the time they reached their 5th anniversary, the photographs still showed smiling faces, expensive dinners, vacations, and arms wrapped around one another. But photographs could not capture what happened after the camera was put away. They could not show Daniel checking the clock. They could not show Elena deleting messages. They could not show the silence that settled between them at night. And they certainly could not show how much resentment had accumulated beneath an ordinary-looking marriage. Now, standing outside the bedroom years later, Daniel was not simply seeing another man on Elena's phone. He was seeing every unanswered question he had carried for years. But one question remained impossible to answer. Had Elena's secrecy created Daniel's jealousy? Or had Daniel's jealousy slowly taught Elena to become secretive? Neither of them was ready to face the answer. And somewhere between those two possibilities, another man had already quietly entered Elena's private life. Elena had known Marcus years before she met Daniel. They had been close friends for a time, but life eventually carried them in different directions. Elena met Daniel. Marcus moved away for work. Their conversations eventually disappeared. Then, several months earlier, Marcus sent Elena a simple message. "It's been a long time. How are you?" Nothing about it seemed romantic. At first, Elena answered because she was curious. Then because she missed the person she had been before marriage became complicated. Soon, their conversations became longer. Marcus asked questions Daniel rarely asked anymore. How was she really doing? What did she want? Was she happy? Those questions unsettled Elena. For the first time in years, Elena felt heard, and that feeling frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. She had begun feeling invisible inside her own home. Daniel was physically present, but emotionally, their conversations had become lists of responsibilities and questions. Marcus, meanwhile, listened without demanding explanations. That difference mattered. Their messages slowly moved from casual memories to private confessions. Elena told Marcus about the tension at home. She described Daniel's constant questions, his suspicion, and the feeling that she was always being observed. She was careful with her words. "Does he hurt you?" Marcus asked one night. "No," Elena replied. "Not like that." She paused before adding, "But sometimes I feel like I can't breathe around him." Marcus told her she didn't have to stay. "You can leave." Elena stared at the message for a long time. She knew he was right. Yet knowing something and doing it were different things. Marcus became more direct as the weeks passed. He wanted Elena to understand that he wasn't asking her to choose him. He was asking her to choose herself. But that distinction became harder to believe as their conversations grew more intimate. They began FaceTiming. At first, the calls lasted 10 minutes. Then 30. Soon, Elena started looking forward to them. Marcus could make her laugh. He remembered details she had forgotten telling him. He listened when she spoke about feeling trapped. And Elena began telling herself that emotional closeness was not the same as betrayal. But she knew it was. One night, Marcus noticed something in her expression. "You keep saying you want to leave," he said. "So why haven't you?" Elena looked away from the screen. "I don't know." Marcus waited. She finally whispered, "I'm scared of what happens after." It wasn't the whole truth. Elena was afraid of Daniel's reaction, but she was also afraid of what leaving would say about the last 8 years of her life. She had built a marriage and an identity around being Daniel's wife. Walking away meant admitting that the life she once defended had become something she no longer recognized. There was another truth she hadn't told Marcus. She had already begun making plans. She had looked at apartments. She had researched finances. She had even discussed starting over with someone she trusted. But she had not told Marcus that she was considering leaving before their relationship became romantic. She wanted to believe she was escaping a broken marriage, not running toward another man. That distinction mattered to her. And while Elena wrestled with that guilt, Daniel was beginning to notice the evidence. One evening, after Elena fell asleep, Daniel picked up the phone she had left charging beside the couch. He wasn't looking for Marcus. At least, that was what he told himself. Then, he saw the call history. One name appeared again and again. Marcus. Daniel stared at the screen. The FaceTime call he had witnessed upstairs had not been their first. It wasn't even their fifth. And suddenly, the question was no longer who the man was. It was how long Elena had been talking to him behind Daniel's back. The name Marcus stayed on Daniel's mind long after he put the phone back. He did not confront Elena. Instead, he began watching. At first, the changes were almost invisible. Daniel noticed when Elena left work 20 minutes later than usual. He noticed when she carried her phone from room to room. He noticed how quickly she turned the screen away whenever a notification appeared. Then he started recording details. He photographed the time on the kitchen clock when she left. He memorized the names that appeared on her call history. He wrote down places she mentioned casually and compared them with the time she had supposedly been there. Daniel told himself he was looking for the truth. But truth was no longer the only thing he wanted. He wanted certainty. Every unanswered call became suspicious. Every deleted message became evidence. If Elena bought coffee on the way home, Daniel wondered who she had been meeting. If she smiled at her phone, he imagined Marcus on the other end. Ordinary moments began changing shape inside his mind. One afternoon, Elena came home carrying flowers. She said a coworker had brought them for everyone at the office. Daniel said nothing. Later that night, he searched the company directory for the coworker's name. The search gave him nothing useful. Instead of letting the matter go, he became more convinced that he was missing something. Elena noticed the change. Daniel was quieter now. He asked fewer questions, but his silence felt heavier than interrogation. One evening, she found him sitting alone at the kitchen table. "You've been acting strange," she said. Daniel looked up. Have I? Yes. He smiled faintly. I'm just tired. Elena knew he was lying. She also knew that he knew she was lying about things of her own. That realization frightened her. For the first time, leaving did not feel like an abstract possibility. It felt necessary. She began thinking about what she would need: money, somewhere to stay, documents, time. She had no clear plan and no guarantee that Daniel would accept her decision calmly. And there was Marcus. She cared about him, but she didn't want to leave one complicated situation only to immediately become dependent on another person. So she waited. Waiting, however, made everything worse. Daniel's suspicion became an obsession. Late one night, while Elena was asleep, he found an old conversation buried beneath dozens of newer messages. Most of it was ordinary. Then he saw one sentence from Elena. I don't think I can live like this much longer. Daniel read it once. Then again. His breathing changed. To Elena, the words had meant exhaustion. She had been talking about the marriage, about feeling trapped, about the life she no longer knew how to repair. Daniel saw something else. He read it as a warning. She didn't want this life. She didn't want him. Maybe, in his mind, she wanted him gone. Daniel stared at the screen until the word seemed to change meaning again. The evidence he had collected was no longer simply confirming his fears. It was becoming the world he lived inside. And now, for the first time, Daniel began imagining what would happen if Elena actually left. The next morning, Elena noticed that Daniel had placed her phone on the counter exactly where she had left it. Nothing was missing. Nothing looked disturbed. Still, she felt watched. She went upstairs and opened an empty suitcase. For several minutes, she stood beside it, unable to decide what to pack. A photograph of their wedding sat on the dresser. She picked it up, stared at the smiling couple, and wondered when those two people had disappeared. Downstairs, Daniel heard the suitcase zipper move. He closed his eyes. He understood that Elena was preparing to leave. And this time, he did not know whether he could accept it. The realization terrified him deeply. The realization terrified him deeply. For Daniel, the possibility of Elena leaving was different from the possibility of an affair. An affair could, in his mind, still be stopped. A relationship could be confronted, explained, punished, or somehow repaired. But leaving meant Elena had already imagined a life in which Daniel no longer existed. That thought followed him through the morning. He watched Elena move around the kitchen, preparing coffee as though nothing had changed. She avoided his eyes. Daniel noticed that too. Are you going somewhere? He asked. Elena paused. No. The answer came too quickly. Daniel nodded, pretending to believe her. But something inside him had shifted. He began searching for proof of a plan. Not because he wanted reassurance anymore. Because he wanted to know how far she had gone. Over the next few days, Daniel noticed small things he had previously overlooked. A folder disappeared from the desk. Elena received an email and immediately closed her laptop. She began talking about money differently, asking questions about deposits, rent, and monthly expenses. One afternoon, while Elena was away, Daniel found an envelope tucked beneath several old documents. Inside was information about an apartment. The name of the complex was unfamiliar. So was the address. Daniel read the page several times. There was a move-in estimate, a deposit amount, a list of required documents. His hands became cold. He placed everything back exactly as he had found it. But the discovery changed him. That evening, Daniel watched Elena come through the front door. She smiled politely. He wondered whether she had already imagined walking through another front door without him. Later, he found another piece of evidence. A conversation between Elena and Marcus mentioned starting over. The words were not explicit. They did not say that Elena had chosen Marcus, but they discussed possibilities, neighborhoods, work, and what life might look like after she left. Daniel read every line. His anger grew slowly. Then came humiliation. He remembered the years he had spent believing he was protecting his marriage, while Elena had apparently been planning an escape from it. He remembered introducing her as his wife. He remembered defending their relationship when friends noticed tension. He remembered telling people that every marriage had difficult seasons. Now he wondered whether everyone else had seen the ending before he did. Elena had not simply found another man. She had imagined another life. That distinction became unbearable. Meanwhile, Elena sat alone in her car after work, unable to start the engine. She looked at Marcus's latest message. "You deserve a life where you aren't afraid to be yourself." She wanted to believe him, but guilt remained. She knew Daniel's behavior had hurt her. She also knew she had crossed a line. Marcus had become an escape from a marriage she had stopped knowing how to confront. With him, she could forget the arguments, the suspicion, and the loneliness. But forgetting was not the same as healing. She had never told Marcus that. She had never told him how much of her attachment to him came from needing somewhere else to breathe. That night, Elena entered the house and found Daniel sitting in the dark. "You're late," he said. She looked at him. "I had work." Daniel nodded. Then he asked quietly, "Were you looking at apartments?" Elena stopped breathing for a moment. The question told her everything. He knew. She lowered her eyes. "I was thinking about leaving." Daniel stared at her. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then he asked the question that would change the direction of their marriage forever. "Leaving me for him?" Elena opened her mouth, but no answer came. Daniel didn't need one. In that silence, he heard confirmation. He stood slowly, but Elena stepped backward. "Daniel, please." He stopped. The room seemed suddenly smaller. For one brief moment, she saw the man she had married beneath the anger, the frightened man who had once made her feel safe. Then his expression hardened again. Neither understood that this conversation would become the last warning before the night everything changed. And neither would forget it. Whatever remained of Daniel's hope began collapsing into something far more dangerous. The warning had been there all along, but neither of them understood what it meant. That night, after Daniel discovered the apartment paperwork, Elena finally stopped pretending everything could continue as before. She found him in the living room, sitting rigidly on the sofa, staring at nothing. "We need to talk," she said. Daniel looked up. "About Marcus?" Elena swallowed. "About us." He laughed once, without humor. "There is no us if you're already planning where to live." Elena remained standing. She had rehearsed this conversation in her head countless times, but now that it was happening, every prepared sentence felt useless. "I need space, Daniel." "You need space?" "Yes." "From me?" Elena looked away. "Yes." The answer landed heavily. Daniel stood. "How long has this been going on?" "What?" "You and Marcus." Elena closed her eyes briefly. "It started with talking." "That isn't what I asked." She knew there was no safe answer. "Months." Daniel stared at her. "Months?" "We were friends before." "You were FaceTiming him." "Yes." "While you were married to me." Elena's voice became firmer. "And I was miserable." Daniel flinched. "You could have told me." "I tried." "No." "You complained." "That's different." Elena shook her head. "I told you I felt trapped. I told you I was unhappy. Every conversation became another reason for you to check my phone or ask where I'd been. I was your husband. You were watching me." Silence filled the room. Daniel looked toward the window. "So you chose him?" "No." "You did." "I chose to leave a marriage that wasn't working." And Marcus just happened to be waiting? Elena didn't answer immediately. That silence made Daniel angrier. He loves you? I don't know. But you love him? Elena looked at him. I have feelings for him. Daniel's expression changed. It was not rage at first. It was something quieter. Something that looked almost like grief. He lowered himself onto the sofa. Did you ever love me? Elena's lips parted. For a moment, she couldn't speak. She remembered their first apartment. Their wedding. Daniel waiting outside the restaurant where they met. The nights when he held her while she cried. The version of him who had once made her feel protected rather than watched. Yes, she finally whispered. But the word did not come quickly enough. Daniel noticed the hesitation before the answer. That was what broke something inside him. He had spent years believing their marriage could survive anything if he tried hard enough. Now he understood that Elena's heart had already moved somewhere he couldn't follow. He stopped arguing about Marcus. He stopped asking about messages. He stopped asking why. His mind narrowed around one unbearable fact. She was leaving. Elena picked up her bag. I need to go. Daniel looked at her. Where? Somewhere safe. The words made him stand again. Safe from me? Elena didn't answer. She moved toward the hallway. Daniel followed. Daniel had followed her before, during arguments, but tonight felt different. There was no ordinary anger left in his face. His questions had become repetitive, circling the same wound from different directions, as though finding a different answer could somehow change reality. Elena sensed it too. She turned around. Daniel, listen to me. This is over. He stared at her. You don't get to decide that alone. I already have. The sentence seemed to echo between them. Daniel's breathing became uneven. He wanted to say something that would make her stay. He wanted to remind her of everything they had survived, everything they had built together. But the words refused to come. Instead, memories flashed through his mind in fragments. Their wedding photograph, Elena laughing at the restaurant, her hand in his during their first vacation, the apartment she had secretly researched. All of it felt like evidence of a life that had already ended. Elena reached for the door. Daniel stepped closer. She froze. For one final moment, neither moved. The argument had reached a place where words no longer seemed capable of repairing anything. Outside, a neighbor later remembered hearing voices through the walls. The neighbor could not make out the words, only the rising intensity, followed by a sudden crash. Inside the house, Elena stopped near the doorway. Please, Daniel. Let me go. For several seconds, there was only breathing. Then came the sound that would permanently divide their lives into before and after. Then, suddenly, the house went completely silent. And neither of them knew what would happen next. The silence after the struggle lasted only seconds, but to Daniel it seemed endless. Then the emergency call connected, and the quiet house filled with distant questions, hurried instructions, and the unmistakable sound of approaching sirens. Whatever Daniel had imagined would happen next was already beyond his control. When responders entered, they found Elena critically injured. Daniel remained inside, stunned and unable to offer a clear account of what had happened. The scene, however, seemed to tell a simple story. There had been an argument. There had been an affair. There was a firearm. And there was a husband standing only steps away from the consequences, unable to explain why the confrontation had ended this way. Paramedics immediately focused on Elena, while officers separated Daniel from the room. Questions came quickly, but his answers came slowly. His voice shook. His thoughts appeared scattered. Again and again, investigators heard the same sentence. I didn't mean for this to happen. The words were not an explanation. They were not an admission of intent. They were the first fragment of a story investigators knew would have to be examined carefully, piece by piece. Detectives began documenting everything. Photographs were taken. Positions were recorded. Statements were preserved. The firearm was secured as evidence, and every detail surrounding it became part of a growing timeline. Investigators noted what appeared obvious, but they resisted the temptation to let obvious become final. Daniel's relationship with Elena quickly became central to the inquiry. Their marriage had been damaged by betrayal, and the affair provided an emotional background that could explain anger, humiliation, and resentment. But investigators understood the distinction between explaining emotion and excusing violence. Jealousy could describe a motive. It could never serve as a justification. As officers continued interviewing Daniel, inconsistencies began appearing in the way he described the confrontation. Some details changed. Others remained frustratingly vague. He insisted that everything had happened too quickly, that he had lost control of the moment, and that he never intended for Elena to be hurt. Still, intent would not be decided by a frightened statement made inside a chaotic house. It would be determined by evidence, testimony, forensic findings, and the sequence of events that investigators were only beginning to reconstruct. Daniel was eventually taken into custody. The handcuffs closing around his wrists marked a quiet turning point. The personal crisis inside the house had become a criminal investigation, and the questions were no longer limited to what had happened between a husband and wife. Investigators now had to determine what Daniel had done, what he had intended, and whether his explanation could survive the evidence. Across town, Marcus received the news. At first, he could barely process Elena's name alongside words describing an emergency. Then he learned that Daniel had been taken into custody, and something colder settled over him. Marcus remembered their last conversation, the hesitation in Elena's voice, and the feeling that she had been trying to tell him something she could not safely say. Then investigators mentioned something that changed everything. Elena had attempted to call Marcus shortly before the confrontation. The call had not been answered. Marcus stared at his phone, realizing that a missed call could carry more weight than any message. Why had she called? What had she intended to say? Had she known that the situation was becoming dangerous? Or had she simply needed someone to hear her voice? Those questions followed Marcus as investigators returned to Elena's phone. The device had not yet been fully examined. Officers photographed it where it was recovered, preserved its condition, and began documenting recent activity. Calls, messages, and timestamps could potentially establish the minutes before the shooting with a precision that memory could not. For Marcus, that discovery transformed grief into uncertainty. He knew Elena had reached for her phone, and he knew his name had appeared there at the worst possible moment. The unanswered call now felt like a message that had never reached him, a warning trapped inside seconds that could not be recovered. Investigators understood its importance too. The phone might reveal whom Elena contacted when confrontation began, and whether another voice, message, or attempt to reach someone could alter the timeline. For the first time, the case seemed to have a witness that could not speak. Then, beneath the evidence markers and the growing paperwork, investigators recovered the phone. Its screen was dark, but its recent call history was still there. And among the last entries was Marcus's name. The phone changed the investigation before anyone fully understood how much it would reveal. Until then, detectives had been working from a physical scene, witness statements, and Daniel's uncertain account. Now they had something different, a record of Elena's life that existed beyond the walls of the house. Investigators began examining her digital activity carefully. Messages were preserved. Call histories were reviewed. FaceTime records were documented. Deleted conversations became potential evidence, and even ordinary exchanges were studied for changes in tone, timing, and frequency. Every fragment offered another piece of the days leading toward the confrontation. At first, what they found seemed to support Daniel's version of events. Elena had been communicating with Marcus. Their messages carried intimacy, affection, and the unmistakable signs of a relationship that had moved beyond friendship. There were conversations Daniel would have considered devastating if he had seen them. For investigators, however, the messages were not proof of justification. They were simply evidence of a complicated marriage and an affair that had already damaged the relationship. Then detectives found something they had not expected. Buried among Elena's conversations was a series of messages to a close friend. The tone was different from her messages with Marcus. There was no romance in them, no excitement, and no attempt to hide what she was feeling. Elena was frightened. She described Daniel becoming increasingly controlling. Small disagreements had begun carrying greater emotional weight. Questions about where she went, whom she spoke to, and when she would return had gradually become part of daily life. What might once have looked like marital suspicion now appeared, through Elena's own words, as something more persistent. In another message, Elena admitted that she was considering leaving Daniel. She also wrote that she did not know how he would react if he discovered her plans. That sentence stopped investigators. It changed the emotional landscape of the case without changing the facts of the shooting. Elena had betrayed her husband. Daniel had every reason to feel wounded, angry, and humiliated. But those emotions could not explain away the decision to use a firearm. The distinction became increasingly important. Detectives were not investigating whether Elena had made mistakes. She had. They were investigating what happened when Daniel confronted those mistakes, and whether the shooting represented an isolated eruption or the culmination of something that had been building for much longer. As investigators reconstructed the timeline, the digital evidence began connecting previously separate moments. Elena's fear, her plans to leave, her communications with Marcus, and Daniel's growing resentment no longer appeared to be unrelated pieces. Together, they suggested a relationship deteriorating beneath the surface, while both sides continued moving through ordinary routines. That contradiction made the case more difficult, not less. There could be betrayal without justification. There could be fear without certainty. There could be anger without permission to cause irreversible harm. Investigators understood that explaining Daniel's emotional state was necessary, but excusing his actions was not. The affair might explain why the confrontation began. It could not determine how Daniel chose to respond when emotions reached their breaking point. The investigation therefore shifted direction. Instead of treating the shooting as a spontaneous act born entirely from jealousy, detectives began examining the months before it. They looked for patterns in messages, repeated arguments, controlling behavior, threats, apologies, and moments when Daniel's anger appeared to intensify. They wanted to know whether the night of the shooting was truly an isolated moment, or simply the most visible point in a longer decline. Marcus's role also became more complicated. His relationship with Elena remained important evidence, but detectives now understood that he was only one part of a much larger story. Elena had been trying to navigate two realities at once: a secret relationship that had placed enormous strain on her marriage, and a growing fear about what might happen if she attempted to escape it. The digital trail did not offer a simple villain or a simple victim. It offered contradictions, warnings, and unanswered questions. Detectives now had to look beyond the messages themselves. They needed to determine whether Elena had documented earlier incidents, confided in others, or prepared for possibility that leaving Daniel could place her in danger. Every recovered conversation mattered more than it first appeared. And as investigators continued reading Elena's messages, one realization became impossible to ignore. The shooting had not begun when the argument started. It had been building long before that night. The next question was how far that pattern extended. The realization that the shooting had been building for months changed the questions investigators asked Daniel. Until then, he had offered fragments: anger, confusion, regret, and the repeated insistence that he never intended for Elena to be hurt. Now detectives wanted the entire story. From the first moment, he suspected Elena was involved with Marcus to the confrontation that ended with a gunshot. Daniel eventually agreed to give his complete version. He said seeing Elena with Marcus destroyed whatever control he thought he had left. He described months of feeling rejected, humiliated, and replaced. According to Daniel, every unanswered question, every secret conversation, and every change in Elena's behavior had convinced him that his marriage was slipping away. He spoke about nights when he could not sleep and mornings when suspicion followed him through the house. He remembered noticing Elena becoming distant, guarding her phone, and finding reasons to spend time away from him. Each discovery, he said, made the betrayal feel more real. But detectives were listening for something beyond pain. Daniel insisted that the confrontation happened in an instant. He said emotions overwhelmed him, that anger became stronger than reason, and that he could no longer think clearly. His attorney would later build upon that account, arguing that Daniel had experienced an overwhelming emotional breakdown rather than carefully planned violence. Prosecutors saw the timeline differently. They pointed to evidence showing that Daniel had noticed the relationship before the final confrontation. He had monitored Elena's behavior. He had questioned her movements. He had discovered that she was considering leaving the marriage. None of those discoveries happened in the same second as the shooting. That distinction became central. Daniel had time to think. He had time to leave the room. He had time to put distance between himself and Elena. He had time to walk away. Instead, the confrontation continued until a firearm entered the equation and an irreversible decision was made. During questioning, investigators repeatedly returned to the same issue. They did not deny that Daniel had been hurt. They did not pretend that betrayal was insignificant. They acknowledged that discovering an affair could produce anger, grief, humiliation, and profound emotional distress. But being hurt was not the same as being entitled to revenge. Daniel struggled with that distinction. His answers became shorter whenever investigators asked why he remained in the confrontation after realizing how angry he had become. He described the moment as something that happened to him, almost as though the circumstances themselves had taken control of his actions. Detectives challenged that idea. Circumstances could influence a person. Emotions could become overwhelming. But choices still existed between one moment and the next. The deeper investigators went, the more Daniel's identity appeared connected to the marriage itself. Elena's betrayal was not merely something he experienced as painful. He seemed to experience it as an attack on his place in the relationship, his authority within the household, and his understanding of who he was supposed to be. That realization became important. Daniel had not simply feared losing Elena. He had struggled with losing control over Elena's choices. When detectives asked what Elena had wanted, Daniel paused. She wanted to leave, he finally acknowledged. The admission changed the room. For months, Daniel had described himself as the person who had been abandoned, betrayed, and emotionally destroyed. Yet, Elena's messages suggested that she had been preparing to escape a relationship she increasingly found frightening. The same event could therefore be viewed from two completely different perspectives. To Daniel, her decision represented rejection. To Elena, it represented freedom. The investigators now had to determine which moments were emotional reactions and which were deliberate choices. The answer would shape everything that followed. That question also forced Daniel to confront something he had avoided since the night of the shooting. His pain was real, but pain did not erase responsibility. His humiliation was real, but humiliation did not create a right to punish another person. The more he was asked to separate those truths, the less convincing his explanation became. Investigators were no longer asking whether he had suffered. They were asking what he chose to do with that suffering at all. And as the case moved toward court, one question remained above all others. Was Daniel's final act truly one uncontrollable moment, or was it the culmination of choices he had been making for months? The evidence was beginning to suggest that the answer would not be found in the final seconds alone. The question of Daniel's choices followed the case into the courtroom, where every version of the past was placed under a harsher light. Investigators had reconstructed the timeline, but now the people inside that timeline had to face one another through testimony, evidence, and memories that could not be changed. Marcus was among the most difficult witnesses. When questioned about Elena, he did not deny their relationship. He admitted that he loved her. His voice remained controlled, but the weight of his words was visible. He knew the affair had contributed to the collapse of Elena's marriage. He knew his presence had intensified Daniel's anger. And he knew that Elena had made choices that had consequences for everyone involved. Yet Marcus refused to accept a responsibility that did not belong to him. He had participated in the affair, but he had not pulled the trigger. That distinction became one of the most painful themes of the proceedings. Elena's family struggled with it as well. Grief rarely followed a straight line, and neither did anger. Some relatives blamed Marcus, believing that his relationship with Elena had helped create the circumstances that ended in tragedy. Others blamed Elena for remaining in a marriage that had become unstable, or for becoming involved with another man while still married. But eventually, the family confronted a truth that was difficult precisely because it was so simple. Elena could have made mistakes. Marcus could have made mistakes. Daniel could have felt betrayed. None of those facts transferred responsibility for the shooting to anyone else. The person who chose violence remained responsible for that choice. Daniel's defense approached the courtroom differently. His attorneys did not pretend the affair had never happened. Instead, they tried to show the man behind the defendant. They described his loneliness, insecurity, emotional deterioration, and growing sense of rejection. They presented him as someone whose identity had become dangerously entangled with a marriage he believed was disappearing. The defense wanted the jury to see Daniel as more than the worst thing he had done. They described sleepless nights, exhaustion, and a man who had gradually lost his ability to cope with what he believed was betrayal. Their argument was that his emotional condition had overwhelmed his judgment when the confrontation finally erupted. The prosecution acknowledged the pain without accepting the conclusion. Their strategy was quieter and, in some ways, more devastating. They showed what Daniel had known before the shooting. He had suspected Elena's relationship with Marcus. He had watched her behavior. He had discovered that she was considering leaving. He had experienced anger long before the final confrontation. Most importantly, he had possessed opportunities to step away. The prosecution argued that emotional pain could explain a reaction without excusing a decision. A broken heart did not create a license for violence. Humiliation did not create one either. The courtroom slowly became a place where every uncomfortable truth had to exist at the same time. Elena had been unfaithful. Marcus had participated in an affair. Daniel had been emotionally damaged by what he discovered. But none of those truths changed the central fact. Only one person transformed betrayal into irreversible violence. As the final days of testimony passed, the courtroom grew quieter. There were no more discoveries capable of changing the past. There were only interpretations of evidence, competing explanations, and the difficult task of deciding where emotion ended and responsibility began. Marcus listened as attorneys described his relationship with Elena. He lowered his eyes when her name was spoken. He understood that whatever judgment the public might place upon him, he would carry his own questions for the rest of his life. Elena's family sat together, united by grief even when they disagreed about everything else. Daniel remained at the defense table. His attorneys rose for their final arguments. They asked the court to consider the man Daniel had been before the shooting, not only the act that followed. They spoke of loneliness, rejection, despair, and an emotional collapse that they believed had consumed his judgment. Then the prosecution prepared to answer. Daniel looked toward the jury. The room fell silent. He was about to hear the final argument that would define how the court understood the difference between being hurt and choosing to hurt someone else. And this time, there would be no more witnesses to distract him from the question waiting at the center of the case. The courtroom eventually reached its final moment, but the ending did not feel like an ending to the people who had lived through Elena's death. Daniel received his sentence, and the judge spoke about responsibility, consequences, and the life that could never be returned. The words were formal, measured, and necessary. Yet when the hearing ended, the silence that followed felt heavier than any sentence. No decision could restore Elena. Her family would leave the courthouse carrying memories that could not be rewritten. They would remember her voice, her laughter, her mistakes, her hopes, and the ordinary moments that had once seemed too insignificant to preserve. Grief would not erase the complicated truth of who Elena had been. She had made choices that hurt people. She had been unfaithful. She had also been frightened, conflicted, and desperate to change her life. Those truths could exist together. Marcus understood that more painfully than most. He had loved Elena, and part of him would always wonder whether things might have been different if he had never answered her messages, never returned her calls, or never allowed their relationship to become something hidden. He knew he had participated in the betrayal that damaged the marriage. He would carry that guilt for years. But guilt was not the same as responsibility for murder. Daniel faced a different kind of future. His sentence could measure punishment, but it could not measure regret. Behind prison walls, he would have time to revisit every warning, every argument, every moment when he could have walked away. He would remember Elena telling him she wanted to leave. He would remember discovering Marcus. He would remember the anger that had convinced him, even briefly, that his pain mattered more than Elena's life. That was the truth he could not escape. The shooting had not erased the betrayal. It had erased every possibility of repairing what came before it. The final narration returns to the phone. Before the investigation, the device had been ordinary. It had carried messages, private conversations, photographs, and a FaceTime call between two people who believed they still had time to decide what came next. The screen had once represented secrecy and desire, a small window into a relationship Elena had hidden from her husband. After the shooting, that same phone became evidence. Detectives examined timestamps, call records, messages, and fragments of conversations. What had once belonged only to Elena became part of a criminal investigation, helping reconstruct the final hours of her life. That transformation carried its own sadness. A device designed to connect people had become part of the record of how one person was lost. And so the story returns to the contradiction at its center. Elena's affair exposed cracks that already existed within her marriage. Marcus became part of those cracks. Daniel's insecurity and resentment deepened them. The relationship had been failing long before the final confrontation. But none of those facts determined the ending. Daniel did. He chose to remain in the confrontation. He chose to let anger guide him. He chose, in a moment or a series of moments, to transform betrayal into violence. That choice made the damage irreversible. There would always be arguments about who was right, who was wrong, who should have left sooner, and who should have known what might happen. There would always be regrets that could never be tested because the past could not be repeated. But the central lesson remained painfully clear. A broken relationship can be survived. Betrayal can be survived. Even heartbreak can eventually heal. Violence changes that possibility forever. Once a weapon enters a moment of rage, there is no guarantee that anyone will get another chance to apologize, explain, forgive, or walk away. Elena never received that chance. Her family never received the future they imagined. Marcus never received the ordinary goodbye he should have had. Daniel received a sentence, but a sentence could never contain the full consequences of his decision. The phone screen goes dark. The messages remain. The memories remain. And the silence that follows is the final reminder that some choices do not simply end relationships. They end possibilities. A marriage can collapse and people can rebuild. A betrayal can wound and people can heal. But once violence enters the story, there is no version of the ending where everyone gets to go home. The tragedy was never that a marriage ended, but that anger was allowed to decide how another human being would live afterward.